Dalton 456 with some more Jeep talk. This one is going to be about the four-wheel drive conversion that I did on my Jeep, as well as some of my takeaways and some of my thoughts. Why would you want to do this? Well, two-wheel drive Jeeps are pretty common. You can get them pretty cheap, and they're usually not beat up. Especially down here in the South, it seems. Because it seems like almost every Jeep I see for sale is two-wheel drive. The good thing about being down here in the South, we don't have rust. So, we don't have all the issues with bolts coming out. We don't have problems with big holes in the floor and stuff like that. So that might be one reason to consider it. Or, in my case, this was my first vehicle. It's got some sentimental value to it, and I kind of just like wrenching on stuff. So, what all do you need to know? Really, there's no hurdles in doing this. Everything pretty much bolts in. There are some upgrades you can do while you're doing this. But other than that, if you can find the parts, you can find the right year range of parts, you shouldn't have any issue. This is mostly going to be based around the 97 to 01 Cherokees, but this is possible on older ones as well. I'm just not well versed with the older Cherokees. On the interior, you'll need a few pieces. One of those pieces is this trim bezel. There's a shifter assembly, and then there's a wiring harness for the light in here. As you can see, I have that so it works on mine. But that wiring harness can be hard to find on eBay sometimes. Sometimes they're listed, sometimes they're not. It's kind of the same thing with this bezel and this shifter assembly itself. Now, you need to know what transfer case you're going to use before you buy these parts. If you're going to have an NP231, this is what you need. And you're going to need this shifter with the gate that's on it. If you want to go with an NP242, which is the all-wheel drive transfer case, meaning you can use it on the road, you don't have to worry about binding up the transfer case and blowing it up. You can use it all the time. And it's also got an off-road functionality, meaning I think it's got a differential in the center, and it actually locks that center differential whenever you go off-road. So that if you would try and go on the road with it in off-road mode, you would bind up the case and probably break something. But generally, people like the 231 better, the NP231, because it's a stronger case, there's more aftermarket. And realistically, most people just take these Jeeps off-road. I guess if you're up north and there's a lot of snow and a lot of ice, that all-wheel drive transfer case would be better. But, you kind of have to weigh your options. But anyway, this is the setup for an NP231. The 242 is going to have a different bezel. And the shifter gate on this shifter is going to be different as well. So that's everything on the interior. Well, almost everything. Really, you don't have to do this, but on the gauge cluster, there is an indicator for the four-wheel drive. It will not work on a two-wheel drive harness. I'm sure there's a way you can go in and you can find the wire where it is in the harness and splice into it. I didn't really feel like doing that, so all I did was, because it works on ground, I pulled the top of my dash, I found the wire on the back end of the cluster. I want to say it was a black with a red stripe, but you should check your factory service manual to be sure on your year that is that color. But I just ran a wire to that, came down, and since it works on the ground, you just have to have one wire go to the switch, and then the other side of the wire goes to a ground, and the light works perfectly fine on mine. Now, the rest of this is pretty much all going to take place underneath. I'll start with the shifter linkage as soon as I can orient myself. Okay, this is going to be a little difficult to see, but up here, this is an Azzies Design Works linkage. It gets rid of this weird contraption that they had from stock. If you've got the extra money in your budget, I'd recommend getting this linkage over the stock one. It's easier to adjust, and it's just better in general. So this up here is where we had to install that shifter. The hole is already in the floor. There's just a plate that covers it. All you do is unbolt it, peel the plate up, drop the shifter in. You could probably put a little bit of silicone around the edges just to seal it up. And that's it for the shifter itself. You don't really have to modify anything else. It's the same cross member for both a 2-wheel drive and a 4-wheel drive. You will need to change the transmission. This is where it gets a little wonky with the 97 to 2001s. You can use the transmission out of a 97 and I think back a few years on a 97. But from 98 to 2001, there are some electrical differences with the transmissions. I've been told you can repin the harness, or you can just put a harness off a newer one. I've never tried. So, good rule of thumb would just be to stick to a transmission close to your year range. Transfer cases are the same way. At some point in time, they did change the transfer case input splines. So certain transfer cases won't bolt up to certain transmissions. Just keep that in mind. Stick close to your year range or do your research. Like I said, this is an NP231. Your speedometer, your speedo sensor will be the same. It's the same whether or not it's 2-wheel drive or a 4-wheel drive. You just have to transfer it over and clock it. If you change your tire size, make sure you get the proper gear and then clock the speedometer drive properly. As you can see here, I do have a slip yoke eliminator kit on mine. It's very recommended. It has more splines and a bigger output shaft, so it's actually stronger, and it allows you to get rid of that slip yoke, which if you extend your let your axle drop too far, the yoke can slip out. This goes to a bolted flange style with a CV, so it helps out with your driveline angles. You don't have crazy vibrations and all. What else? Oh, this is also a front drive shaft. So I've got the same shaft, front and rear. This works for me on about 4 inches of lift. It may not work on stock height vehicles. Just something to keep in mind. They do have a lot of companies that make these drive shafts, like Adams, Tom Woods, so, you know, you have a lot of options as far as what you can do. The rear end, nothing will change. And in the front, obviously, you're going to have an axle now. You can use a high pinion axle, or you can use a low pinion. It doesn't matter what your vehicle really originally came with. It's best to try and find an ABS axle if you're on a budget, because the ABS axles have stronger shafts. Make sure it's non-center axle disconnect. The way you can tell is on the top of the pumpkin, there's going to be a linkage, or there's some kind of difference in the top of the pumpkin with the connection and all that. You know, I haven't actually seen one, but I know the non-center axle disconnect axles are stronger than the center axle disconnects. Other than that, just make sure you have the proper gear ratio to match the back. I went through, I put a limited slip diff in mine while I was at it. You know, it's a good time to upgrade it while it's out of the vehicle. I also completely redid all the bearings, new ball joints, installed these axle tube seals on the end. I put chromoly shafts. You really don't have to. And the only other thing I really recommend are these adjustable arms. They're really good for being able to adjust your caster and preventing death wobble. Because if you don't have enough caster and you don't have a good alignment, you will have death wobble. And, you know, as anyone that owns a Jeep knows, death wobble's scary. You never know when it's going to happen. Something you really don't want to deal with. Other than that, that's really all I can think of at this moment. This is not meant to be an in-depth guide on how to do this. This is just some pointers and some thoughts. And until the next Jeep Talk, later.